A ninth son who took the crown, a baby killer, a queen who became a saint, a king who got murdered in a sewer by his own subjects, and many more. Before Scotland joined with England to form Great Britain, it was ruled by a long and dramatic line of monarchs, some heroic, some infamous, some almost forgotten, and a shocking number of whom came to horribly violent ends. In this documentary from History Calling, I explore every Scottish king and queen between Kenneth MacAlpin and James VI, tracing the full history of the Scottish crown across more than 750 years of war, intrigue, and legacy, from the 9th century AD to the year 1625. You'll hear about powerful rulers like Robert the Bruce, the supposed freedom fighter who became a national icon, and I'll even show you a replica of his skull. The tragic Margaret, Maid of Norway, whose early death sparked a succession crisis. James IV, whose marriage to Margaret Tudor laid the groundwork for uniting the thrones of Scotland and England. And Mary, Queen of Scots, whose escapades ended in execution. From medieval power struggles to royal scandals and the eventual union of the crowns, this is the complete royal story of Scotland, told one monarch at a time. Before we start, I should say that it was tricky to actually know where to begin with the Scottish monarchs. Unlike in England, there isn't a very clear event, like the Battle of Hastings in 1066, to demarcate a completely new and single royal dynasty with a clear line of succession, which can be used as a jumping-off point. What is now Scotland was, in the deep past, not a single administrative unit, and was instead divided up into various mini-kingdoms with different rulers, some of which you'll hear about in a minute. The process of these units combining into one kingdom was slow and messy. The surviving sources are often few and far between and leave a lot to be desired in terms of what they tell us, and as a result, there were arguments for beginning this video with lots of different kings. In the interests of not being here for a month, however, I had to pick one, and that's what I've done. I'm sure some people won't like who I chose, as they'll think I should have begun even earlier, but by the end of the video, I don't think you'll be able to say that you were shortchanged and that I didn't look at an awful lot of Scottish history for you, though of course I can only very briefly summarise each monarch's life for you here. Thankfully, the decision about where to stop with James VI, the last monarch who was, for a time, King of Scotland only, was much easier to make. There are also no contemporary images for the earlier kings, so I've sometimes had to resort to stock images or footage to make up the shortfall, which I hope you'll forgive. If you're interested in the monarchs of England from 1066 up to 1603, and of Britain from 1603 to the present day, I'll leave my videos on them linked below for you, and also remind you about them in the end cards when I finish this video. If you'd like to look at the book I used as my main source for this episode and learn much more about the Scottish monarchs than I can tell you here, it's edited by Richard Oram, it's entitled The Kings and Queens of Scotland, and I've linked it in the description box for you and added it to my Amazon storefront. I'm also providing a review of it to my historical figure and time traveller patrons this week, which you can find by joining one of those tiers on my Patreon site at patreon.com/historycalling, also linked below. Alright, let's begin our list. The first monarch I'm introducing you to is Kenneth MacAlpin, otherwise known as Kenneth I. Born in 810, he ruled over the kingdom of Dalriada from about 840, then became king of another group known as the Picts in 848, before dying in 858. Having combined these earlier two kingdoms together, he is generally acknowledged as the first king of Scotland, though there was actually still a long way to go before it would become the country we know and love today, and for many years yet, the rulers you're about to hear about are referred to in contemporary annals as kings of the Picts or of Alba. Kenneth's successor was his brother Donald I, born about 812, and who reigned from 858 until 862. We know next to nothing about him, though he was renowned as a great warrior. The next ruler was Kenneth I's son, Constantine I, born in around 836. His reign, following that of his uncle rather than his father, highlights the fact that in this era the succession was not yet based on the idea of the crown passing from father to son. What was really important was being an adult male and part of the royal family, but even then the rules were flexible. Constantine died in 877, fighting off invaders from Dublin. Then came his brother Hugh, another son of Kenneth I. We don't know when he was born, though the 830s seem like a good guess, and he ruled from 877 until 878, when he was killed by his cousin Gerac or Gregory, son of Donald I. Gerac now took power for 11 years until 889, and of his life and reign we know very little, though he may have shared power with a cousin called Eochaid, son of Rune, king of Strathclyde. The pair might have been deposed rather than killed, that's how vague and sparse the sources are, for in 889 we hear of a new king. This was Gerac's or Gregory's cousin, Donald II, son of Constantine I. He reigned until 900. Again, we don't know when he was born, but he dealt with a number of Viking raids during his reign and died at Forres in Moray of an unknown cause. From this point on, we see the crown swinging back and forth a lot between the descendants of Constantine I and King Hugh, a situation not unlike the much later Wars of the Roses in England when descendants of several of Edward III's sons duked it out for the crown, and if you know how many of them were actual dukes, you'll know what a pun that was. I'll leave my playlist on the Wars of the Roses linked for you if you want to learn more about it. Power now went to Donald II's cousin, Constantine II, who was the son of Hugh and whose birth year is unknown. He is notable as the first monarch known as King of Alba rather than the Picts. Writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, David Brune says that, since Alba had hitherto denoted Britain in Gaelic, this represents an extraordinary change in terminology, suggesting that the adoption of Alba as the kingdom's name represented the coining of a radically new identity, and perhaps signifying an attempt, following a period of disruption and uncertainty between 875 and 889, to establish a new political order based on dynastic kingship. Constantine also successfully fought off more Viking raiders and reigned until about 943. Different sources give different years, somewhere between 940 and 945. Whatever the exact dates, this was an unusually long reign which provided a level of continuity and stability not hitherto known in nascent Scotland. But even more strange, though nice for Constantine, is that he didn't lose his throne because he died or was deposed. Instead, he abdicated, perhaps due to his age, and became a monk at St Andrews. Old habits die hard though, and he still engaged in one last raid into England in about 950, before dying and being buried at St Andrews in 952. He was succeeded by his cousin Donald II's son Malcolm I, though Malcolm only lasted until 954 when he was killed at Moray and supposedly buried at Iona. The throne now went to Constantine II's son, Indolf, who was born about 927 and reigned from 954 until his death in 962, when he was killed by the Vikings at a place called Invercullen, which was probably either Cowie or Cullen. He too was supposedly buried at Iona. Malcolm I's son, Dubh, took the reins, ruling for just 4 years until 966. Indolf's sons wanted power for themselves, and as a result of the fights that broke out in the royal family, the king was killed by the men of Moray at Forres. Fun fact, his death apparently coincided with a solar eclipse on the 20th of July that year. His successor was Indolf's son, Cullen, who lasted all of 5 years before being killed. You'll note that a shocking number of these blokes are getting killed after very short reigns. This one was wiped out by the son of the King of Strathclyde for having done something very bad beginning with the letter R to the guy's daughter. The throne now went to Kenneth II, son of Malcolm I and brother of Dubh, who came to power in 971 and had a fairly lengthy reign, certainly by Scottish standards, lasting until 995. He is remembered for invading England and taking part in a conference of kings at Chester in 973, at which the English king, Edgar, was also present. Quarrels over power led to his murder on the orders of Fenella, daughter of the Earl of Angus, who was taking revenge on Kenneth for having killed her son. Next, we have Constantine III, known as Constantine the Bald, for what I assume are obvious reasons, who lasted all of 18 months before being killed by his successor, Kenneth III, in 997. Constantine was the last ruler to be descended from King Hugh. Kenneth III was the son of King Dubh, who had died back in the summer of 966, so that at least tells us that Kenneth wasn't born any later than 967, though we don't know his actual year of birth. He ruled from 997 until 1005, when he was killed in battle by his cousin Malcolm. He may have been buried at Iona. Malcolm II, born in an unknown year to Kenneth II and his Irish wife, his maternal grandfather may have been the King of Leinster, ruled from 1005 until 1034. This man was later known as the Aggressor and the Destroyer, which I think gives you a good insight into his personality, his actions, and why he lasted so long in an era when a lot of kings were struggling to make it even a decade without getting murdered. He has a generally positive reputation as an effective king, though he had his losses, such as his unsuccessful siege of Durham in England in 1006 and being forced to submit to King Canute of England, Denmark and Norway in 1031. He did, however, defeat a Northumbrian army at Carham-on-the-Tweed in 1018 alongside his ally Owen, King of Strathclyde. This meant that Lothian, north of the Tweed, was now part of Scotland, and when Owen died soon afterwards, possibly of battle wounds, Malcolm II was able to take Strathclyde too. Scotland's borders as we know them today were finally taking shape. Malcolm apparently wanted his grandson Duncan, child of his daughter Bethoch, to succeed him, and wiped out a few more relatives to help to clear a path to power for this young man. Perhaps because of this, there are rumours in later sources that he was assassinated, but all we know for sure is that he died at Glamis on the 25th of November, 1034. Now we get to King Duncan I of Shakespeare fame, who was born around 1010 and ruled from 1034 until 1040. The image of him as an old man presented by Shakespeare in his play Macbeth is therefore entirely fictitious. This guy was in his 20s. Macbeth, another man whose posthumous reputation has been heavily altered by Shakespeare, was the ruler of Moray. His wife, Gruach, you may know her as Lady Macbeth, was probably the niece of Malcolm II and granddaughter of Kenneth II. He and Duncan clashed at Pitgavney near Elgin, and Duncan was defeated and killed. And so we have arrived at the infamous king, Macbeth. Born in roughly 1005, his father was the King of Moray, of which Macbeth became ruler in 1032. He was likely either the nephew or grandson of Malcolm II and was the King of Scots from 1040 until his death in 1057. He faced down numerous threats to his position during that time, including a 1046 rising by Earl Siward of Northumbria, sponsored by the English king Edward the Confessor. Siward actually defeated Macbeth and appointed a puppet king of Scotland, who doesn't seem to have controlled very much land, but the pretender was overthrown and possibly killed by Macbeth soon after. The king was secure enough in his position to go on a pilgrimage to Rome in 1050, and he and his queen were known patrons of the church. Gruach, by the way, is the first queen consort of Scotland whose name is known to us, and her personality, from what we know, was nothing like the scheming Lady Macbeth's. In medieval Scotland, of course, no one was safe for long, and in 1054 Siward was back to try again, invading Scotland in support of King Duncan's son Malcolm Canmore, whom Edward the Confessor hoped to make a vassal king under his own control, and who was also possibly a relation of Siward through Duncan's wife. Siward won, though it was something of a Pyrrhic victory that cost the life of his son, among others, and was difficult to capitalise on, with Malcolm not yet reigning over very much Scottish territory. He kept fighting though, and on the 15th of August 1057, at the Battle of Lumphanan, he succeeded in defeating and killing Macbeth once and for all. Malcolm didn't become immediate king of the Scots, however. Instead, Lulach mac Kilcumgain, who was Queen Gruach's son from her first marriage to the King of Moray, born no later than 1032 and known as the Unlucky or the Simpleton, was the titular king until Malcolm killed him too the following March. Malcolm III was the first monarch of the House of Canmore, and this surname, which began as a nickname and was only given to him centuries later, means great head or great chief, and it shows you just how successful he was. As is the case with so many of the men I've discussed so far, We don't know when he was born, but his father died in 1040, and he was evidently old enough to assume power in the mid-1050s, so I would say he was born no later than the mid-1030s. He married Ingebjorg in around 1060 to 1065, again sources differ, who was the widow or daughter of the Earl of Orkney and had 3 sons by her. She was dead by the end of the decade, however, and he remarried in 1069 or 1070 to Margaret, sister of Edgar Atheling, the Anglo-Saxon claimant to the English throne, which had by then fallen to William the Conqueror. She was also the great-niece of the deceased Edward the Confessor and a real-life saint. Yes, Queen Margaret of Scotland became a saint, just like her great-uncle Edward. The couple would have 6 known sons and 2 daughters, with the boys, because realistically girls didn't get to inherit at this point, having a claim to the English throne thanks to their mother's lineage, which is perhaps why Malcolm chose their oldest son, not his first boy by Ingebjorg, to be his successor. Partly because of this marriage, relations with the Norman invaders to the south were fraught much of the time, and after King William invaded Scotland in 1072, Malcolm agreed to get rid of the Anglo-Saxons he was sheltering, apart from his wife of course, and give up his eldest son Duncan to the King of England as a hostage. Despite this, he still invaded Northumbria in 1079, though in the end the peace treaty was renewed between Malcolm and King William's son Robert Curthose, and as Richard Orme says, though, quote, often presented as a defeat for Malcolm, this settlement marked the high watermark of his power. For, as Robert's hasty building of a castle at what became Newcastle upon Tyne revealed, Malcolm had successfully pushed his frontier far to the south. Relations with the new William II were at first good, and Duncan was released and sent back to Scotland, but it was still the English who would lead to his father's death. In November 1093, after a falling out with King William, Malcolm engaged in a battle with the English at Northumbria alongside his eldest son by Margaret, named Edward. Both were killed, and the king's body was initially left lying on the battlefield, though he was later buried at Teignmouth Priory, then moved to Dunfermline to lie next to Margaret, who died just days after her husband and son. Then ultimately they both ended up in Madrid of all places, thanks to the efforts of Philip II of Spain. So much for Margaret's eldest son inheriting the Scottish throne. Instead, fate favoured Ingebjorg's firstborn boy after all. But not quite yet, for there was now a twist in the tale. Instead of one of Malcolm's sons inheriting the crown next, it went to his brother, King Donald III, known as Donald the Fair, born in or before 1040 and inaugurated at Scone in early 1094. Some accounts say he seized the throne by laying siege to Edinburgh Castle and expelling his nephews from the realm, but honestly, we know very little of what really happened. Likewise, we know little about his life before he suddenly became king in his mid-50s, except that much of it was spent in Ireland, where he had fled to escape Macbeth. Just months after his accession, though, Malcolm and Ingebjorg's son, Duncan, born before 1072, and the man who'd spent much of his youth as a hostage in England, invaded with an English and Norman army at his back, and took the throne as Duncan II in May 1094. He was dead in November, murdered by Melpeder, ruler of Mearns, at Mondins near Stonehaven, and supposedly buried on Iona. Donald III was back in power, and this time he stayed until 1097, at which point he was captured alongside his nephew Edmund, a son of Malcolm and Margaret who had sided with his uncle against his siblings in a power move. The pair had been caught by Edmund's younger brother and another of Donald's nephews, Edgar, who had his brother chained up and ultimately sent to live out his days in a monastery, and his uncle blinded. Donald was supposedly killed in 1107, but we really don't know what happened to him, though he ended up buried at Dunkeld, then Iona. And so we come to King Edgar, fourth son of Malcolm and Margaret, and most likely born in the late 1070s. He had gained his throne with the help of the English and was very much a vassal of Henry I, who took Edgar's sister Edith, also known as Matilda, as a wife in 1100, probably without Edgar having much say in the matter. He was described by Elred of Rievaulx as sweet and lovable, employing no tyranny, no harshness, no greed against his people, but ruling his subjects with the greatest charity and benevolence. His reign was largely peaceful, and he died, unmarried and childless, in January 1107. He was buried at Dunfermline, and the throne went to his younger brother, Alexander. King Alexander I was born in the 1070s and was another vassal king of Henry I. He even married that king's illegitimate daughter, Sibylla, a woman considered immodest by contemporary chronicler William of Malmesbury and not very pleasing on the eye either. It was clearly a political union orchestrated by King Henry, and the couple had no children. Alexander was also forced by Henry to allow his, Alexander's, younger brother David to control much of southern Scotland. He was deeply religious and continued a series of religious reforms instigated by his mother, St. Margaret. He died at Stirling in 1124 and was buried in Dunfermline Abbey. The throne now passed to the aforementioned David, ninth son of Malcolm III, and I'd like you to just let that sink in for a moment because it's not often that a ninth surviving son gets the crown. Born in about 1084, David I was apparently the one who pushed for the blinding of his uncle Donald back in the 1090s, when he himself would still have only been a teenager, so this was not a kind and forgiving guy, and maybe that's why he lasted so long. He had spent much of his life in England, where his sister, Edith/Matilda, was queen, remember, and was well treated by his brother-in-law, Henry I, who allowed him to marry Matilda de Senlis, Dowager Countess of Northampton-Huntingdon, and a member of the extended English royal family, in 1113. Their son Henry was born in circa 1115, but would ultimately predecease his father in 1152. Queen Matilda of Scotland had long since died in 1130. David was very religious and highly Anglified after his years in England, and his disdain for the inauguration ritual at Scone, which had no church involvement, was so severe that he had to be talked into going through with it. Other notable events in his 29-year reign included attempts up until the mid-1130s by Alexander's illegitimate son to take the crown, until this man, named Malcolm, was finally captured. David also responded to these threats by solidifying his hold over ever more of Scotland through the use of castle building and loyal retainers. He also periodically supported the ultimately doomed cause of his niece, Empress Matilda, when she tried to take the English throne after her father Henry I's death in 1135, though he also negotiated advantageous peace deals with her cousin and rival, King Stephen, when it suited him. When it seemed like Matilda was about to be crowned in 1141, however, David travelled south to join her at her coronation, only for the whole plan to fall apart at the last minute, forcing them to flee. See my video on Matilda, who is the basis for the character of Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen in House of the Dragon, to learn more. In Scotland itself, things were fairly peaceful from 1138 onwards, and David was able to expand the machinery of royal government and household with the creation of new offices based on the English model. The economy, church, and the law also developed further in his reign, and he was the first monarch to introduce a homemade Scottish coinage into his country, so that the kingdom was in many ways a far better place when he died at Carlisle in 1153 than when this most unlikely of kings had ascended to the throne. The next monarch was David's eldest grandson, Malcolm IV, born in 1141 and so just 12 years old in 1153, the first of many underage monarchs of Scotland, as we'll see. Despite his youth, there was no formal regency, though real power seems to have lain, at least initially, with a group of powerful nobles around the king. There were rebellions against the rule of this child monarch from the children of Alexander I's illegitimate son, the man imprisoned in 1134, but these came to naught, and perhaps a more serious problem was the pressure from the new English king, Henry II, who sought lands and homage from Scotland and its king, which Malcolm had to give. Adding insult to injury was the fact that Henry wouldn't knight the boy, which was an ardent wish of the young monarch. Malcolm's position as a mere vassal king was further hammered home when Henry summoned him to do military service in 1159 in France. Malcolm and his younger brother William willingly went, and he was finally knighted, But his nobles were furious at the way he had prostrated himself to the King of England and risked Scotland's independence along the way, and they tried and failed to capture him upon his return in 1160. The practice of paying homage to Henry continued, and Malcolm even gave his brother David over as a hostage to England in 1163. Suffering repeated bouts of illness from 1161 onwards, which have since been associated with a disease called Paget's disease, he died unmarried in December 1165 and was buried in Dunfermline. The throne now went to his younger brother, William I of Scotland. He was born in around 1143 and would become Scotland's longest reigning monarch ever while the kingdom was still separate from the rest of Britain. Having been stripped of his earldom of Northumberland when he was a teenager in order to satisfy the demands of Henry II, William was obsessed with getting it back, to the point that he tried to get the King of France to help him do so in 1168. This enraged Henry and did serious damage to Anglo-Scottish relations. Still, things had improved enough for William to attend the English court in 1170 and form a friendship with King Henry's son of the same name. When King Henry and his boy fell out, William decided to try to help the younger man, still hoping to get back his English earldom. This ultimately resulted in his capture and imprisonment in Normandy in 1174, which was a serious humiliation for both king and country, as was the treaty he had to agree to, complete with loss of lands, provision of hostages, and confirmation of Scotland's subordinate status to England in order to secure his freedom. The English king also chose William's wife for him, Ermengarde de Beaumont, who he wed in England in 1186, though it was 1198 before their son, Alexander, was born. There were constant domestic threats to the king's power, as other men who felt they were better suited to the job tried to take it from him. They all failed, though, and William proved effective at strengthening royal power within Scotland, even if he was in other ways a lapdog of the English king. The humiliating treaty which had secured his freedom in 1174 was annulled in 1189 for 10,000 marks, however, thanks to the wishes of the new King of England, Richard the Lionheart, who needed the money to go off crusading, and William was finally legally free as well as physically. William's refusal to initially acknowledge the accession of Richard's younger brother John in 1199, this is Bad Prince John of Robin Hood fame, meant that they had a difficult relationship from the get-go, and it never became good. John ended up extracting a humiliating climb down from King William in 1209, which included the payment of 15,000 marks and the provision of 2 of his daughters as hostages to the English to be married off as John saw fit. William was by now ageing and in poor health, and on the 4th of December 1214 he finally gave up the ghost at Stirling. King Alexander II, born in 1198, was 16 years old when he became King of Scotland. Despite his youth, he was smart and ruthless, and as King John's position in England disintegrated, he was forced to sign Magna Carta in 1215, Alexander took advantage by seizing lands and homage from northern barons in England. This didn't last long though, as when John died in late 1216, the Pope ended up excommunicating the Scottish king and placing his realm under spiritual interdict until Alexander swore fealty to the new English king, Henry III. Relations with Henry were nevertheless not bad for many years, and Alexander married the English king's sister, Princess Joanna, in 1221, though they had no children and Joanna died during a trip back to England in 1238. Alexander didn't even bother having her body brought back to Scotland for burial. He remarried to the French Marie de Courcy in 1239, and their son, named after his father, was born in 1241. One notable sign of Alexander's vicious personality was his brutal suppression of uprisings against him in the Highlands, which included having the last member of the troublesome MacWilliam family killed, an infant girl whose brains were dashed out according to Orem. He eventually died in 1249 as he fought to bring what are now the Scottish Isles, but which were then in Norwegian hands, under his control. The rumour was that St. Columba, protector of the Isles, had finished him off. The crown passed to his young son by Marie, Alexander III, then 8 years old, and on the 26th of December 1251, still only 10 years old, he was married off to Henry III's daughter Margaret at York. Their daughter, also called Margaret, would eventually be born in 1261, then their son Alexander in 1264, and another son named David in 1273. It is a later account of his inauguration at Scone in 1249, by the way, which provides the earliest evidence we have for the use of the famous Stone of Scone, aka the Stone of Destiny, being in use for that ceremony. Alexander III went through several regents as the Scottish barons fought for power over the young king and the country, and was even kidnapped by one faction in October 1257. He came through it all, though, and took personal control in 1260. The remainder of his reign was marked by fights with the Norwegians over control of what are now the Scottish Isles, excluding Orkney and Shetland, with Scottish control already by then in place, confirmed by the Treaty of Perth in 1266. Queen Margaret died in 1275, Prince David in 1280, and Princess Margaret was married off to King Eric of Norway in 1281, though he was 7 years her junior, but then she too died, giving birth to her daughter, another Margaret, in 1283. The king's heir, Prince Alexander, died too in 1284. The Scottish succession now hung on the life of the little Princess Margaret of Norway, the king's only legitimate grandchild. He did remarry in 1285 to Yolande of Dreux, and apparently a ghost appeared at the wedding feast, I kid you not, and the marriage therefore seemed doomed. As he was riding home to her at Kinghorn in Fife in March 1286 in the pitch black and deteriorating weather, he became separated from his companions, and it appears that his horse stumbled and threw him, breaking his neck. His body was found the next day. The result of this unexpected death was chaos for Scotland. The new monarch was Alexander's infant granddaughter, Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway, but hers is a tragic story. Her mother had died at or around her birth, her father was only turning 15 at that time, and little Margaret was under the control of the Norwegian magnates. As the nominal Queen of Scotland in her own right at the age of 3, she was never crowned or inaugurated, which was very important at this time, so you can argue amongst yourselves as to whether you think she deserved the title of Queen. She was a desirable heiress, and her great-uncle, Edward I of England, wanted her to marry his son and heir, and thus unite the crowns of the northern and southern kingdoms. There are real shades here of some early plans for another infant female monarch, Mary Queen of Scots, 250 years later. A council was put in place to rule Scotland on Margaret's behalf, and it was arranged in 1290 that she was to travel to her kingdom, where various interested parties were angling to get her married off into their families. Sadly, little Margaret, then aged 7, died on the trip, apparently on the Isle of Orkney. Her body was taken back to Norway and buried. It was the end of the House of Canmore. Enter the houses of Balliol and Bruce, and an incredibly turbulent time for Scotland. John I of the House of Balliol was born in 1249, probably in England, where his paternal family was from. Think of Balliol College, Oxford, which was founded by his father. His mother was Scottish, and through her he was the great-grandson of William I's brother, Earl David of Huntingdon, through David's eldest daughter. This made him the next heir to the throne after little Margaret of Norway died. But he had rivals, the Bruces, who were descended from Earl David's second daughter. Again, serious similarities to the English Wars of the Roses here. The Scots looked to Edward I of England to mediate a solution for them, and he exploited the situation by making all the various claimants who weren't him declare that he was overlord of Scotland. A legal hearing to decide on the next king dragged on from 1291 to 1292, during which Scotland was stuck in an interregnum. Finally, Edward decided in favour of Balliol, whose reign is dated from November 1292 onwards. As with so many Scottish monarchs, it didn't last long, and it also resulted in abject humiliation for the king and his realm. Having refused to bend to the English king's demands for fealty and military service, and tried to make a French alliance instead, Scotland was invaded by the English in 1296. John ended up surrendering to Edward and being forced to abdicate, and he, his son, and the famous Stone of Scone, upon which all Scottish monarchs were inaugurated, were taken back to London. The stone was not returned until 1996, and you can hear its incredible story of survival in my video all about it, which I'll link below for you. John was locked up in the Tower of London until 1299, then eventually allowed to live in exile in France, where he died in around 1313. His reputation was ruined, and he is known to history as Tomb Tabard, meaning empty surcoat. His fall caused another interregnum, this time lasting from 1296 until 1306, during which Scotland was ruled by a council on behalf of Edward I of England. We now come to Robert the Bruce, one of Scotland's most famous kings. Born in 1274, he had family connections to Ireland as well as Scotland and spent considerable portions of his life in England too. His first wife was Isabel, daughter of the Earl of Mar, whom he married in 1296 and with whom he had a daughter called Marjorie. Isabel was dead by 1297 though. His sister was also the wife of Eric II of Norway. When John Balliol fell and Robert saw his country was going to be run as an occupied Plantagenet province, to quote Orem, rather than given to him as a vassal king, he decided to try to take the crown. However, despite years of pursuing this goal, by the turn of the 14th century he had still not attained it, and ended up on the run much of the time from Edward I, his occasional ally with whom he was on good enough terms again by 1302 to be allowed to marry Elizabeth de Burgh, daughter of the Earl of Ulster, and obtain promises that King Edward would support his claims to be King of Scotland. This was an uneasy alliance with Edward though, and Robert evidently realised at some point that he would never be king at this rate unless he forced his English neighbour's hand. Still, his actual route to the throne was very messy. He murdered another prominent Scottish magnate, John Comyn of Badenoch, in the Church of the Greyfriars in Dumfries on the 10th of February 1306, and the only way to avoid justice from either King Edward or Comyn's supporters was to declare himself king. He was duly inaugurated on the 25th of March at Scone. The English king came after him immediately, and Robert ended up fleeing into the Highlands while his female relations were sent to the supposed safety of Kildrummie Castle, where they were captured by the English and some of them locked in iron cages, though not Queen Elizabeth, despite what the movie Outlaw King, starring Chris Pine and Florence Pugh, shows. Robert staged an epic comeback, however, and managed to repeatedly defeat his Scottish and English enemies over the course of the next few years, and was even able to call a parliament in 1309. In 1314 he defeated the English forces at Bannockburn, recovered his queen and daughter, and sealed his place in Scottish history as one of their favourite kings. He's less popular where I'm from for having invaded the north of Ireland and declared his brother the High King of the island in 1316. As well as two daughters, he and Elizabeth had twin boys in 1324, of whom one, named David, survived, and the Queen died in 1327. With England in turmoil after Isabella of France deposed her husband, Edward III, Robert seized the opportunity to attack, and eventually force a peace in 1328, which included recognition of Scottish sovereignty, English assistance in lifting his excommunication by the Pope, and marriage of his heir to Edward's sister, Princess Joan. The king's health was now failing, it looks as though he had leprosy, and he died in 1329. The crown now passed to the orphaned 5-year-old David II. He is notable as the first king crowned in a papally recognised religious service in 1331, but he faced a rival in the shape of Edward Balliol, son of John, who was born in around 1283, lived much of his life in various states of imprisonment or exile, but came to Scotland in 1332 and had himself crowned at Scone. Although the Scots got rid of him, he returned with an English army and won the throne in 1333, becoming Edward III's vassal king. The child king, David, meanwhile, went into exile in France in 1334, along with his little wife Joan and his sisters. Back home, his supporters recovered much of his lands, but took a great deal for themselves as well. David was back aged 17 in 1341 and spent the next few years building up his power base, but he was defeated, injured and captured during an invasion of England in 1346 and sent to the Tower of London. It was 1357 before he was released and allowed back to Scotland, by which point Edward Balliol had been ousted and died in 1364. He was separated from his childless queen, who remained in England and died in 1362. He remarried to his mistress, Margaret Logie, in 1363, but they had no children, and the marriage broke down within 5 years. Attempts to have it annulled so he could remarry did not come to fruition before his own death of natural causes at Edinburgh Castle in 1371. We now come to, I think, the most famous Scottish royal house of them all, and the one which will take us to the end of the video, the Stuarts. David II's successor was his half-nephew Robert II, born in about 1316 to Robert the Bruce's daughter Princess Marjorie and her husband Walter Sixthigh Stuart, with a D not a T, of Scotland. Married firstly to Elizabeth Muir, who had died in 1355, he had 4 sons plus daughters by her and more children by his second wife, Euphemia, Dowager Countess of Moray, whom he married that same year. He married these children into the great Scottish houses, and the sons also proved adept at seizing plenty of land for themselves, seemingly strengthening his position even more. However, serious problems arose when his boys got too big for their boots and couldn't be reined in, and in 1384 his eldest, John Earl of Carrick, effectively deposed him and took over as lieutenant. A disastrous campaign against the English later, and Carrick was kicked out in 1388 in favour of his brother Robert Earl of Fife. King Robert, now just a puppet king to his son, died in 1390, his queen having predeceased him a couple of years earlier. Robert III was born around 1336 or 1337 under the name John, and was Robert II and Elizabeth Muir's eldest son. He was the Earl of Carrick I mentioned a minute ago, in fact, who forcibly took, then lost, the position of his father's lieutenant. He married David II's niece by marriage, Annabella Drummond, in about 1367. Despite the embarrassing loss of the lieutenancy to his younger brother, the Earl of Fife, John ascended to the throne anyway in 1390 and changed his name to Robert to match his deceased father's, and also confusingly that of his brother, the aforementioned Lord Fife. Notable events in his reign included the decision to make his son and heir the Duke of Rothesay, after the Stuarts' ancestral home, which is still the title the heir to the throne holds in Scotland to this day. This son then sought to usurp the father's power, just as the king had once done to his own father, by becoming the monarch's lieutenant and using his parent almost as a puppet. This really didn't work out. Prince David, Duke of Rothesay, was eventually arrested by his paternal uncle, the former Earl of Fife, now the Duke of Albany, in 1401, soon after Queen Annabella's death, and starved to death in Falkland Palace in March 1402. King Robert had agreed to the arrest and raised no public objection to his son's death, saying it was divine providence. His heir was now his second son, James, but he was captured by the English in March 1406, and his father died just days later. James I, born in 1394, was just 11 years old when he became king, and spent the first chunk of his reign as a prisoner of the English, while his realm was managed by his uncle Albany, the guy who'd killed James's big brother, and then, after Albany's death in 1420, by his son, James's cousin, Murdoch. The Scots wouldn't take any orders from him, given his compromised position, not to mention his age, and this unsatisfactory state of affairs would continue for 18 years, until James was finally ransomed, released and returned to Scotland in 1424, complete with an English wife, Joan Beaufort, niece of the Duke of Exeter. They would have one surviving son, named after his father. His return was not a happy family reunion. He had Murdoch and several other Albany family members executed in order to secure his own power base, and soon alienated his people by his lavish spending and the taxes that this, along with the need to raise money to pay for his ransom, required. He secured grand marriages for his daughters into major European royal houses and tried, with limited success, to broaden his authority in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. A botched attack on the English-held castle of Roxburgh in 1436 deepened his unpopularity, and eventually was one of the factors which led to him being assassinated on the 21st of February 1437 at the Dominican convent at Perth. Having heard the would-be killers coming to get him, James tried to flee for his life in a sewer tunnel which had unfortunately for him been recently blocked up at the far end to prevent the loss of balls from his tennis courts. And so his assailants found him pinned down in what was literally for him a dead-end situation. They stabbed him to death, so ending a technically quite long but fairly dismal reign. James II was born in 1430, the survivor of a set of twins, and came to the throne after his father's murder, aged just 6. The Scots really did have a shocking number of underage monarchs. His mother, Queen Joan, was wounded in the attack, which killed her husband, but escaped and was able to rally support for herself and her child, ensuring that the conspirators who killed James I were executed. A lieutenant general, bit like a regent, was named in the form of James II's cousin, Archibald, 5th Earl of Douglas. He was the closest adult male relative little James had in Scotland, but he died of plague in 1439, the same year Queen Joan was temporarily locked up for remarrying without permission. She would die in 1445. 3 major families, the Crichtons, the Livingstons and the Douglases, duked it out for power in Scotland for years afterwards, with the latter 2 eventually becoming the most dominant. The king, who was known as Fiery Face because of a red birthmark on his left cheek, made a spectacular marriage in 1441 to the very well-connected Mary of Guelders, daughter of the Duke of Guelders and niece of Philip, Duke of Burgundy. The Livingstons' lands were forfeited in favour of the Douglases and the Queen in early 1450. Then Douglas lands were seized the following year, and James ended up personally murdering the 8th Earl of Douglas at Stirling Castle in 1452, despite having promised the man safe conduct. He and his queen welcomed their son, another James, that same year. James II went on to dismantle the Douglases' power base over the next few years and take their lands. He died on the 3rd of August 1460, aged 29, when a cannon he was standing next to during the siege of Roxburgh Castle broke apart and hit him with shrapnel. James III, born in 1452, was 8 when he became king, and was at first protected by his clever and powerful mother, Queen Mary, who took over the siege of Roxburgh when her husband died and took the castle in less than a week. She died in 1463, however, when he was still a boy, and James Kennedy, Bishop of St Andrews, took over the minority government. He then died in 1465, and Sir Alexander Boyd of Drumcole seized control of the king. James married the King of Denmark's daughter, Margaret, in 1468, and began his personal rule, wiping out the by now hated Boyd family and having Alexander executed. The king's lofty but expensive and impractical ambitions to extend his power into mainland Europe, plus his taxation policies, willingness to sell pardons for serious crimes, and his unapproachable nature — he barely left Edinburgh, thus allowing law and order to break down even further elsewhere in Scotland thanks to his lack of oversight — served to make him increasingly unpopular. He was hated within his own family too, and his poor treatment of his wife, siblings and children, including forfeitures, forced marriages and fishy deaths, led the survivors to rebel against him. One brother, Alexander, Duke of Albany, invaded with an English army and the future Richard III in 1482, while 3 half-uncles captured the king at Lauder to try to become lieutenant generals of Scotland, a bit like a regency council. Although the king escaped and regained power, Albany continued to be a thorn in his side until the duke's death in 1485. Queen Margaret died in 1486, and her son, James, Duke of Rothesay, had such a poor relationship with his father that it was an army acting in his name which killed the king on the 11th of June 1488 at the Battle of Sauchiburn. James IV was born in 1473 and was 15 years old and orphaned when he became king. He was kept in a minority government until 1495, even though he was 22 years old by then. That minority government was overseen by a royal council made up of the strongest magnates and was therefore more representative and less fractured than other councils had been in the past. It is from James's reign that the Scottish crown jewels, otherwise known as the Scottish regalia or the honours of Scotland, date, and they still survive today and are considerably older than almost all of the English crown jewels are. They've also had a wild history to get them from James to us, which you can hear all about in my video on them, linked on screen and below. During his personal rule, James took care to travel through his country and be seen, and as for foreign policy, he supported the pretender to the English throne, Perkin Warbeck, in the 1490s, only eventually being brought into the Tudor fold in 1503 by being allowed to marry Henry VII's 13-year-old daughter, Margaret. It was the marriage which would facilitate the eventual union of the two crowns a century later. Their only surviving son, another James, was born in 1512. Despite the marriage, the Scottish and English continued to have a problematic relationship, and in 1513 James attacked England while his brother-in-law Henry VIII was away campaigning in France, which was a Scottish ally. An army sent by his sister-in-law, the Queen Regent of England, Catherine of Aragon, thrashed his troops at the Battle of Flodden, and James was killed. James V was yet another child king, who came to the throne aged 17 months. His first regent was his mother, Queen Margaret, who lost the job when she remarried to the Earl of Angus, who was a member of the Douglas family. Next, the government was ruled by the Duke of Albany, who was the cousin of James IV, then his stepfather, James V's stepfather, despite the fact that Queen Margaret had come to hate her second husband, as had her son. The pair eventually divorced, and Margaret married for a third time to Henry Stuart Lord Methven. James escaped from Edinburgh Castle, where Angus was holding him, at the age of 16 in 1528, and began his personal rule. In 1536, he sailed to France to collect a bride in the shape of Mary of Bourbon, but decided upon seeing her that he didn't like her, and instead wed Madeleine of France, daughter of Francis I, on New Year's Day 1537 in Notre Dame in Paris. Unfortunately, the new queen died in July of TB at the Palace of Holyrood back in Scotland. Not to be deterred from a French union, James next wed the widowed Mary of Guise in 1538. After two short-lived sons, they had one surviving child, a daughter called Mary, born on the 8th of December 1542. James never met her, though. By the time of her arrival, he was dying of cholera or dysentery at Falkland Palace, where he expired when she was 6 days old. Mary, Queen of Scots, is, I think, the most famous Scottish monarch of all. Raised for the first 5 years of her life in Scotland, and at first mooted as a possible wife for Henry VIII's son, the future Edward VI, she was then taken to her mother's French homeland for safety in 1548, leaving Mary of Guise behind, who managed to secure the regency for herself in 1554. Mary, Queen of Scots, eventually married the French Dauphin in 1558, who soon after became Francis II of France in 1559, before dying at the age of 16 in 1560. Unbeknownst to her Scottish commissioners at the time of the marriage, Mary had signed a secret document saying that if she died first, she left her entire kingdom to her French husband. Hardly the mark of a good monarch. As it was, though, the now Dowager Queen of France, whose mother had died in 1560, returned to her own realm to begin her personal rule as Queen of the Scots. She was now a French-speaking Catholic in what had, in her absence, become a Protestant country, however, and the fact that her English was never as good as her French after her childhood was, I would argue, a serious oversight on the part of those who raised her, along with her generally poor political education. The problems her religious and cultural alienation from her country caused were only exacerbated by her ill-advised marriage to her English half-cousin, the wild and disreputable Henry Stuart Lord Darnley in 1565, with whom she had a son called James in 1566 in a surprisingly tiny room in Edinburgh Castle. Darnley had by then assisted in the murder of Mary's Italian favourite, David Rizzio, pretty much right in front of her in Holyrood Palace when she was 6 months pregnant, and with the bloom very much off the rose when it came to her marriage, it is little wonder that she was suspected of involvement in Darnley's murder in February 1567, especially when she married one of the alleged conspirators, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, just months later in May. Her reputation in ruins and abandoned by her husband, who she never saw again and who died in 1578, she was forced to abdicate in favour of her 1-year-old son in July 1567 and eventually fled to England in 1568, seeking the protection and assistance of her cousin Elizabeth I. Big mistake. Mary had been antagonising Elizabeth for years by insisting that she was the rightful Queen of England because Elizabeth Tudor was illegitimate. Which, to be fair, she was, but she held her crown through her father's will and an Act of Parliament, which left it to the descendants of his sister Mary, not his sister Margaret, who Mary Queen of Scots was descended from, in the event of Elizabeth dying without children. Elizabeth was in no mood to help a French-raised Catholic queen to retake her throne north of the border, and she instead had Mary imprisoned for 19 years in a series of castles and houses. Eventually, it emerged that Mary was plotting to have Elizabeth killed and herself put on the English throne, so Elizabeth beat her to the punch and had her executed at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587, though she later denied that she had intended for the death warrant to be enacted. Mary was buried at Peterborough Cathedral and later moved to Westminster Abbey by her son, who is the final monarch on our list. James VI of Scotland had a miserable childhood after the abdication of his mother, whom he never saw again after the age of 1. Raised a Protestant, he was taught by a strict tutor called George Buchanan, who often beat him and knew little in the way of stability or family life, running through a series of regents, the first 2 of whom, his half-uncle and his grandfather, died violent deaths. The third, the Earl of Mar, passed away of natural causes, and the fourth, the Earl of Moreton, was overthrown in 1580 and executed. The fifth was the Duke of Lennox, but James was kidnapped from his custody in 1582 by William Ruthven, Earl of Gowrie, and his supporters, from whom he escaped in 1583. The king now operated increasingly independently. In 1589, he went to Norway to collect his bride, the 14-year-old Anne of Denmark, who had been unable to travel to Scotland due to storms. With her, he had 7 children, though there have always been rumours that he was in fact gay, and he certainly had a series of male favourites. He was also obsessed with witches, believing that a storm that beset he and Anne on their way back to Scotland after their marriage was a product of sorcery. He supported a series of despicable witch hunts in Scotland, called the North Berwick Witch Trials in 1590, personally oversaw the torture of women accused of witchcraft, and wrote a book about witches and witch hunting entitled Demonology in 1597. In 1603, Elizabeth I of England died, and despite not actually being the heir to her throne, according to the aforementioned will of Henry VIII, James was the senior blood claimant through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor, and he acceded unopposed as James I, uniting the crowns of the northern and southern kingdoms. Never again from that day to this would there be a monarch of an independent Scotland. He moved to England with his family and stayed there until his death, avoiding assassination attempts such as the Gunpowder Plot to blow him up in Parliament in 1605, and styling himself, when he was able to because there was some pushback against it, as the King of Great Britain. His eldest son, Henry, died in 1612, leaving his second boy, Charles, as his heir, and his wife, with whom he'd had a sometimes difficult relationship, particularly with regards to how their children were raised, died in 1619. James himself passed away in 1625 and was buried in Westminster Abbey with his great-great-grandparents Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Phew, gang! Well done if you made it through all of that. If you did, leave the word superstar in the comments, because that's what you are. You can also let me know there which of the Scottish monarchs is your favourite and why. If you want to learn about the English monarchs leading up to James I, see my video looking at all of them from 1066 until 1603, and if you want to hear about what happened after his death, see my video on the British monarchs from him until the present day. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.